Today's shiur begins 13 lines from the bottom of Daf Yud Tes. The Gemara opens with a quote from the Mishnah back on Daf Tes Zayin with Beis. We saw there someone had accepted Nazirus while in a cemetery, while in a state of defilement to the dead. The Mishnah said, Yotza v'nichnas oilin loy min haminyan. If we just translate that literally, it means upon leaving and re-entering the cemetery, so that will count toward his new Nazirus period, his new Nazirus of Tahara. Kotoni, oilin loy min haminyan. It said in the Mishnah that the person gets credit toward his Nazirus counting. So the Gemara asks with a tone of wonderment, Tamiha, Mishum de Yotza Chal Alei Nazirus, because he exited the cemetery, thereby his Nazirus begins. Omar Shmuel, Kegon Shiyotza V'Hiza V'Shana V'Toval. Oh, it's not just he exited the cemetery. He exited the cemetery and avoided any contact with the dead for a period of 7 days, during which he had the sprinkling of the Pora Aduma ash water mixture, and not only on the 3rd day of that week of purification, but on the 7th day as well. That's the second. V'shana means the second sprinkling, and he immersed in the mikveh. He thereby achieved tahara. Oh, so once you achieve tahara, once you achieve purification, so your new Nazirus can start. Question. Ella, from the reading of the Mishnah, it said Yotza v'nichnas, and he re-entered. So does that mean as follows? Ella nichnas hu de oilin lo min haminyan lo nichnas ein oilin lo min haminyan. That only if he re-entered the cemetery does he get credit, but if he doesn't re-enter the cemetery, he remains tar, so it doesn't count toward his Nazirus. That's impossible. The Gemara explains, Lo mi baya komar. The Mishnah in teaching Yotza v'nichnas is a Mishnah in the lo mi baya sense. Things that don't need to be taught. And the Gemara explains, Lo mi baya Yotza kol oiso hayom. I don't have to tell you that his Nazirus gets restarted if he remains outside the cemetery the entire day. In other words, after achieving purification, the week goes by, and he remains the entire next day out of the cemetery. So, of course, his new Nazirus got started. Elo afilu nichnas boy bayoim oilin loy min haminyan. If on the very day that he achieved tahara, he went back into the cemetery. In other words, a full day of purification didn't go by. It still is considered as if he started, and albeit then redefiled, but it's considered as if he started his new Nazirus counting. So that is the explanation that we give to our Mishnah. That Yotza v'nichnas would mean the person would accepted Nazirus while in the cemetery, accepted it in a state of defilement. He left the cemetery, spent a week in purification, had the sprinkling done to him and the immersion in the mikveh, and then without a whole day going by, he re-entered the cemetery. And we say that nevertheless is describing a person that had momentarily, if you will, restarted his new Nazirus period. Omru le Rav Kahana Rasi l'Rav. My taima lo mifarshis lon kaholimili. They asked Rav, by whom they had studied, Rav Kahana Ravasi, why didn't you explain to us the Mishnah in this fashion? In other words, it struck them as this is a brilliant explanation of what otherwise appears to be a vague Mishnah. Why didn't you treat us to this fine explanation? Omar lahon, so Rav answered them, Amino, I figured Dilma lo tzrichiso, that you didn't need to hear the explanation. In other words, I thought that maybe you could figure it out on your own, or you would have known it anyway. Before we go further in the Gemara, let's take a look at a couple comments. One by Rashi. The Rashi that we're looking at is toward the end of the Rashi column. Elo afilu nichnas, the salkadaitoch, the kevan de nichnas. I would have thought that by going back in, havile kemikoro, keshenozar rubeis hakvoros v'lu oilun lo min aminyan v'lo chaylo le nazirus detara. That by going back into the cemetery, he is simply recreating his original status, and there is no restarting of the nazirus of Tara. Kamash Malon, what the Mishnah tells us is Kevan shiyotzav v'ishon v'toval, since he left the cemetery, spent a week in purification, Havile Nazir Tohar, he is considered at that point a Nazir in purity. The Chayole Nazir's Detara, V'yadar Itmi, maybe Korban Tuma. And that having been achieved, Nazir's Detara, his re-entrance is now mechayiv him, is now going to obligate him in bringing the Korban characteristic of a Nazir Tohar Shinitma. This, by the way, is in contrast to his original status of someone who accepted Nazirus in a state of Tumah. We've learned in the past that when he becomes Torah, he does not bring sacrifices. However, by describing this individual as someone whose Nazirus of Torah restarted, or started anew, and then he defiles himself, he does have to bring sacrifices. The Tosfos, toward the bottom, says, Hochi Garsinon, Lo Mibaya Yotza Kol Oisa Hayom, Elafilu Nichnas Bo Bayom. The Sakadaitach Lo Solik Le Miktzis Tara Mishehiza Ad Shinitma. I would have thought, this without the teaching of this Mishnah, that partial Tara that he experienced from the end of the sprinklings until his actual re-defilement wouldn't count as if he started a new Nazirus. And the Mishnah reveals to us that that is not so. We continue now with the other Tanaic opinion on this topic, namely Shitas Rebbe Ozer, and what we are going to see is his Shita, that if the Nazir that had been Tomei when he accepted the Nazirus left the Tumah and then went back on the same day, went back into the Tumah, went back into the cemetery on the same day that he had achieved purification, he will not be obligated to bring the sacrifices of a Nazir Tomei. This is in contrast to what we just got finished saying before. So now the Gemara continues. Rebbe Ozer Omer, Lo Bo Bayom, the sacrifice obligation will not apply if he returns Bo Bayom that same day. Shenemar Vayomim Horishonim Yiplu. And the Pasuk features the loss of days, or the, we'll say in the plural tense, or in the plural form. And we see this means Ad Shiyu Yomim Rishonim. The obligation of bringing a sacrifice doesn't apply unless a couple of days of Tahara were observed. The pasuk is quoted on the side of our Gemara, Bamidbar Perek Vav Pasuk Yud Beis. It says, "Vehizil Hashem es Yemei Nizro vehevi keves ben shnosu leosham vayomim harishonim yiplu ki tomei nizro." The Yomim Rishonim, the previous observed days in the plural form, minimum plural is 2, when they fall away because of his defilement, then the obligation of bringing Korban Tuma of a Nazir applies. Before going into the Gemara, we glance at the side where we have a topic heading, which reads as follows: Ula Masbir Shitas Rebbe Ozer. Ula will explain Rebbe Ozer's opinion. She'en chiv korbanos tuma elim ki shnei yomim shel nazirus betara. unless you have 2 days of Nazirus that had been observed in purity, lafuke shemnitmo miyad achrei shenitar, to the exclusion of a case of someone who became redefiled immediately after achieving purification. Ula omer sheyesh lechalek bein tomei shenozar lenozir tohor shenitmo miyad. There is a distinction that we're going to make between a person who was tomei, who accepted Nazirus, versus someone who was a Nazir Torah that became tomei immediately. Now the Gemara. Omar Ula. Lo Omar Rabbi Eliezer Elo B'tomei Shenozar. Rabbi Eliezer's halacha that you need 2 days of tahara and then exposure to tumah in order to be chayev in korbanos of tumah, this applies only to the case of a person who had been tomei originally when he accepted his Nazirus. That's the case of a person standing in a cemetery and then accepting upon himself Nazirus. Upon leaving the cemetery, he has a week of purification. And then, after the week of purification, he redefiles himself. Does he bring a sacrifice? So, Rabbi Ozer will tell you, in that case, he will have to have observed 2 days of tahara, and then become defiled and bring the sacrifices. Let's continue in the Gemara. Aval b'nazir Torah shenitma, afilu yoim echad soser. However, if you have a person who accepted Nazirus in a state of tahara, even 1 day is enough for defilement to erase whatever he observed, and that would result in his bringing of the korban tumah of a Nazir. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. Omar Rava, my taimo de Rebbe Lezer. What is the reason for Rebbe Lezer, as Ula explained? Omar Kra, ki tomei nizro. Mishum de betuma nozar. The pasuk in Babin Barvov, pasuk Yud Beis, that spoke about v'hayomim harishonim, the multiple days, that is referring to a case of ki tomei nizro, means that's referring to the case of someone who accepted Nazirus in a state of tumah. But someone who was tor when he accepted the Nazirus and then became tomei, even if it became tomei within the first day, he will be subject to the halachas of a Nazir shenitma, which would have to bring korbanos. The Gemara raises a question. You'll notice we have a long question marking, and at the end of the long question, you're going to see the Gemara says tiyufta. So this would be a very strong question against what we have learned. So now let's see. Eisvei Abaye, Hareini Nazir Me'ayom. A person accepts upon himself a vow of Nazirus for 100 days. The double underlining that you see in this source is featured on the side, nitma, and then you'll see betchilas or besof, hadgoshas hazmanim shenitma mikrim shonim, the highlighting of the times of tumah in different cases. So someone accepted upon himself Nazirus of 100 days, the nitma betchilas mea, and he becomes tomei at the beginning of the 100 days. Yochol yehi soser. Is there any soser? Is there any loss? Talmud lomar vayomim horishonim yiplu. And you'll notice the dashed underlining highlights this pasuk that's quoted time and again in this source. And we say ad shiu lo yomim rishonim, until he has days that he observed at the beginning. V'zeh ein lo rishonim. This doesn't have that. He accepted Nazirus, and at the very beginning, he became tomei. So it's not going to result in the laws that are unique to a Nazir shenitma. Let us add, based on the Tosfos commentary, that when this source is asking Yochel Yesoser, is there going to be any soser, meaning any loss? And the source says, no, there's no loss because he became Tameh immediately. Tosfos says that if he became Tameh, let us say, on the first day of his 100-day Nazirus, that one day will count toward his Nazirus, even though he became Tameh on that day, and he'll have to observe after the purification period of 7 days, he'll have to observe an additional 99 days. In other words, he doesn't lose the day of Nazirus that he observed when he became Tameh on that first day, or possibly in a day and a half. As long as 2 days have not gone by, he doesn't lose that brief amount of time that he observed, and all he does is he counts the balance, an additional, as we said, additional 99 days. If, however, he would have become Tameh 3-4 days into the Nazirus, and more, he will lose everything that he counted till that point. Another case, Nitmo B'sof Me'ah, Yochel Yesoser. Let us say he became Tameh at the end of the 100 days. The last day, day 100, he becomes Tameh. Does he lose everything that he counted till that point? Talmud Lomar Vayomim Horishonim Yiplu. The pasuk says there will be a loss of the early days. Michlal diiko achronim v'zeh ein lo achronim. When you speak about first days, first means there are last. Are there further days beyond day 100? No, there are no achronim. There are no further days. So the idea of losing days doesn't apply in this case. It might sound a little ironic, but that's the way it is. Since he becomes Tameh on the last day, and there are no further Nazirus days, there is no loss of the previous counting that he's done. In other words, all the Nazirus remains intact. Nitmo biyoimea choser achas. Let us say he became Tameh on day 99. Yochol lo yehe soser. Will he not lose out what he counted till that point? Talmud Lomar Vayomim Horishonim Yiplu. Michlal diiko achronim v'zeh yesh lo rishonim v'achronim. If, however, he became Tameh on day 99, then we can't say that he won't lose out, because what did the pasuk say? The pasuk said the Nazir who loses is a Nazir that had previous days and following days. In this case, there are following days. A person who became Tameh on day 99, there is still the balance of that day and tomorrow. Therefore, he is subject to hefsid, to losing his Nazirus counting. Veha b'tomei shenozar lo motzis amris. This source that we just read cannot be applied to a person who was defiled when he accepted his Nazirus. Don't forget, Ula, in explaining Rebbe Ozer, said that the idea of having 2 days go by and then becoming defiled is a requirement in the case of a Tomei Shenozar. We're reading a source now that speaks about that very scenario of 2 days having gone by, and it could not apply to the case of a Tomei Shenozar, midikotoni, from the fact that it said in this source, Hareini Nazir Me'ah v'nitma betchilas Me'ah. The source described someone who accepted Nazirus for 100 days and then became Tameh. So, what was his status when he accepted the Nazirus? He was a Tahor individual. Vikotani, and it says regarding a Nazir Tahor Shenitma Ad Shulo Yomim Rishonim, multiple days. Tufta, this is a refutation of the explanation that we had seen given to Rebbe Ozer, Ula had said that the din of Yomim Rishonim, multiple days going by, and only then would there be a Korban Tumah requirement, that applies to a Tomei Shenozar. But a Nazir Tohar Shenitma, even if a moment goes by, even without multiple days going by, he will be chayav to bring the korbanos of Tumah. Here we see that is not so. Here we see that even in the case of a Tohar, Nazir Tohar Shenitma, he doesn't lose out, and he won't bring sacrifices unless multiple days, 2 days of Tara go by. So this represents a refutation of the distinction that Ula had made in explaining Shitas Rebbe Ozer. Omar lei Rav Papa Abaye, Holin Yomim de Kwamrinan. The days, we saw the term days, Yomim. It's a plural form of the word day. What is meant by that? So let's just imagine, once again, you have someone that was Makabel Nazirus, he accepted upon Nazirus, and we say that he doesn't lose out unless Yomim go by. What is meant by that? And here we're going to be very, very specific. Is it the Nofik Chad Umaschilin train, that one full day of Tahara went by and he started the second day and then becomes Tameh? Oidilma the Nafkin train Umaschilin Tlosa, that 2 full days of Tahara went by and he begins the third day and then becomes Tameh. What are the circumstances concerning which we say he will experience hefsid, loss? Lo hava biyodei. The question had been posed to Abaye. Abaye did not have an answer. Also, Shailei Rava, he came and asked it of Rava. Omar lei, Rava responds. He says, Yiplu ksiv. Rashi, a few lines up from here in the Rashi, Omar lei Yiplu ksiv, the mashma de levin train benefila. That means 2 would have to be falling away. Ukigon the nafkin train va'ailin tlas. What that means then, 2 full days of Tara went by, and he's into the third day. Then we will talk about him losing whatever he had counted till that point. We have a note that the Rosh, in explaining this line of Gemara, has a different approach. But for our purposes, let's stick with the Rashi and continue now in the Gemara. V'itzrich lemichtav yomim, v'itzrich lemichtav yiplu. We need both terms. In other words, the word yomim is also in the plural form, and the word yiplu is in the plural form. Di kosav rachmona yomim, v'lo kosav yiplu. Havi amina, ad dinafkin train, va'ailin tlosa. There's a different girsa in the Rashi. And let's take a look at it together. The Rashi, you'll notice, is highlighted with a double star, the lower quarter of the Rashi column. Loshen acher, di kosav rachmona yomim, v'lo kosav yiplu. Let us correct ourselves and, let's say, backtrack just for a moment. For the sake of accuracy, we had said up till this point in the Gemara, where Rava answered, he said, Yiplu ksiv, and following the first approach taken in Rashi, not the approach of the Rosh, nor the approach of the second Lashon in Rashi, but following the first approach in Rashi, Rava's answer was that the number of days that need to go by before we can say that he's mafsid is like the second possibility, the nafkin train umaschilin tlas, and that we learn from Yiplu. Yiplu, the days, 2 full days have gone by, and then he would lose credit when he becomes Tomei. The Gemara went on to say, V'itzrich lemichtav yomim, v'itzrich lemichtav yiplu. And the Gemara says, the ikosav rachmona yomim, had the Torah written just yomim, without yiplu. Rashi suggests, if the Torah would have said, Vayomim horishonim ya'azov, that the first days went by, without using the word yiplu, Have Amino, I would have thought, and now following the Bach's reading of the Gemara, I would have thought, Adenofach Chad Ve'ailin Train, had the Torah simply said the word Yomim without the word Yiplu, I would have thought, well, that one day went by and the second day entered, and then he becomes Tomei. Kosav Rachmona Yiplu. Therefore, the Torah uses the word Yiplu, which conveys the idea of 2 full days having gone by. In other words, combining Yomim Yiplu, it means 2 full days go by, and then he becomes Tomei, and then we speak about the Nazir losing that which he had counted. The Kosav Yiplu velo Kosav Yomim, had the Torah written Yiplu without the word Yomim, Have Amina Afilu Chad. I would have thought even one day. Kosav Rachmona Yomim. Therefore, the Torah uses the word Yomim to exclude thinking that even with one day going by, he would lose. And hence, the conclusion, according to the way we read the Gemara, following the Rashi Girsa, first Lashon, and the Bach, only if 2 full days go by and he enters the third day and then becomes Tomei, do we speak about the Nazir losing those days that he counted. But if less than that, if only one day went by and then he became Tomei, he will pick up his Nazirus, counting from that point, getting credit for the first day, counting 99 more days. And now we arrive at a new Mishnah. On the side we have a topic heading, Machlokes Beis Shammai uBeis Hillel. We'll see a Tanaic controversy between Beis Shammai and Hillel. B'misha Nazar Harbe Naziros B'chutz La'aretz. Person accepted upon himself a number of Naziros, multiple Naziros, while abroad, while outside the land of Israel. V'hishlim Oisam, and observed all of those Naziros outside of the land of Israel. V'achar olo le'Eretz Yisrael, and then he comes to Eretz Yisrael. It's pointed out in the Meforshim that even though you might get the impression this idea of coming to Eretz Yisrael is something optional, that's not really so, because he has sacrifices that he has to bring at the end of Nazirus. So he has to come to Israel to offer the sacrifices. So what happens then? We should point out, by way of general knowledge, and that is that the land outside of Israel, on a rabbinic level, has the status of being defiled to the dead. Why the rabbis ruled thusly, that's, we'll say, beyond the scope of today's shiur, but there was a rabbinic ruling that Eretz Ha'amim, the land outside of Israel, the land of Israel, has the status of Tumas Mace. The note on the side, our topic heading continues, Maisa Behilni Amalka. There's an incident involving Hilni, the queen. Shenozra b'chotzot, she accepted Nazirus while outside of Israel. V'achar kach also Eretz Yisrael, and then she came to Israel. Ubesof nitma, and then became Tameah, and then became defiled. So now the Mishnah. Misha Nazar Naziros Harbe V'hishlim es Naziruso. A person who had accepted multiple Nazirios and completed his Nazirus vow, fulfilled his obligation, V'achar kach bol arts, and then he came to the land of Israel. Beis Shammai Omrim Nazir Shloshim Yom. Beis Shammai has a lenient ruling relative to Beis Hillel, and that is that we impose upon him the need to observe another 30 days, a basic Nazirus. Beis Hillel Omrim Nazir Batchila. Beis Hillel says whatever number of Naziros you had observed outside Israel, when you come to Israel, you have to start all over again and observe that same number again. Maisa behilni amalke sholach beno lemilchama, an incident involving the queen Hilni, whose son went to war. V'yomra, and she said, she vowed, Im yovo b'ni min ha-milchama b'shalom, if my son comes back in peace from the war, ehei naziru sheva shanim, I'm accepting upon myself 7 years of nazirus. Uba b'no min ha-milchama, and her son returned in health from the war. He returned in peace. V'hoisa naziru sheva shanim, and she fulfilled her vow. 7 years of Nazirus. Ubesof sheva shanim also loretz, and at the conclusion of the 7 years, she came to the land of Israel. Uvaharua Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel ruled that she must observe another 7 years. Ubesof sheva shanim nitmeis, and another 7 years passed, and she then became Tameah. She became defiled. V'nimseis Nazira Esra Chashana, and sum total then, there were the 7 years outside the land of Israel, 7 years of Nazirus observed because of Beis Hillel's ruling in the land of Israel. Having become Tameah at the end of those 7 years, that is mafsid, it's soiser, it cancels all of the Nazirus that she observed till that point, and she has to start all over again, another 7 years, a total of 21 years. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, lo hoisa Nazira ela arba esrei shana. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the Tanakama in the Hilni Hamalka account. The Gemara. Kotoni Reisha, it said in the Reisha, after the Nazir who had accepted Nazirus outside of the land of Israel and observed it, came to the land of Israel. Beishamai omrim Nazir shloshim yom, upon arriving in Israel you are obligated to observe 30 more days of Nazirus. Beis Hillel omrim Nazir b'tchila. You have to observe the number of days, or the length of time of your Nazirus outside the land of Israel, you must observe in the land of Israel. So we see that there's a machlokes Beisham Beis Hillel concerning someone who came from outside of Israel to Israel. What is the root or the basis of their machlokes? On the side of the Gemara, you'll notice a geometric form, a diamond, which you can also see in the Gemara text, which features the following. It's Shlavim lahasbir machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel sheba Mishnah. Stages in trying to explain this machlokes. Leima beha komifliki. Can we say that the following is the root of the machlokes? The Beis Shammai Savri Eretz Ho'amim Mishum Gusha Gozru Oleh. Beis Shammai, who is of the more lenient opinion here, it's because he holds that when the Rabbanon, when the rabbis declared Eretz Ho'amim, the land outside of Israel, as being defiled, the defilement was associated with the gush, with the ground, and it's not a defilement of the entire airspace and atmosphere. And with an analysis like that, Rashi's approach, which by the way is in stark contrast to the Rush, who has a different girsa, is an opposite girsa in the Gemara, and hence a different explanation. Rashi's approach is that since only the gush, only the dirt or the ground was ruled defiled, it's a lower level of tumah than avir, than declaring tumah on the entire airspace. And there would be a practical nafkamina, by the way, between these two approaches, and that is, if a person, let us say, left Israel, entered the Eretz Ho'amim, the lands outside of Israel, contained in a Shida Tevo Migdal, a self-contained entity, a chariot, a box, possibly an airplane, but he is contained within a separate entity. If you say that the gezerah is only on the ground, on the dirt, you would not be tamei while contained within the Shida Teva Umigdal that we described. However, if you take the approach that the Gzeira was not just on the Gush, but on the Avir as well, and let's read on in the Gemara, continuing at the top of Daf Chof, Ubeis Hillel Savri Mishum Avira Gozro Leha. And Beis Hillel, who took the more stringent opinion, maybe it's because he holds that the ruling concerning Eretz Amim was a ruling of defilement or contaminating, we'll say, the entire airspace, or if you prefer, the entire atmosphere. And that represents a more severe level of tumah, whereby it would be even more severe than tumas meis, in which one could be protected, as we've learned in the past, while contained within a shida teva migdal. If the tumah ruling concerns the avir, you would not be protected. The Gemara says, lo, the analysis we just suggested, the chiluk between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, gush versus avir, is not the analysis, not the approach. The kuli alma mishum gusha gozro. Rather, everyone is in agreement that the type of tumah that was imposed on Eretz Amim is a tumah of the ground, the dirt. Ubeis Shammai Savri Bistam Nazirus Kanisna. Beis Shammai holds that the rabbinic stringency of needing to observe a new Nazirus was the imposition of a basic Nazirus, an unqualified Nazirus, which is 30 days. Ubeis Hillel Savri Ki Kanisna. Beis Hillel says that the rabbis who imposed this stringency on the one who had been a Nazir in Chutz La'aretz and then comes to Eretz Yisrael, B'tchilas Nazirus. The Gezerah, or the Knas, levied upon them is the expectation to observe an entire new Nazirus period, one corresponding to the length of the Nazirus that you had observed outside of Israel. Maisa Behilni Hamalka, and we saw the Tanakama saying that at the end of the Hilni Hamalka story, she had observed 21 years of Nazirus. Rabbi Yehuda said that she was a Nazira only 14 years. What's the story with regard to Hilni Hamalka as far as Rabbi Yehuda is concerned? Ibayalaho B'shenitmeis v'aliba de Beis Shammai o idilmo b'shalonitmeis v'aliba de Beis Hillel. The second of the two possibilities is fairly straightforward, and that is that Hilni Hamalka, she observed a 7-year Nazirus outside the land of Israel, and upon coming to the land of Israel, Beis Hillel would have told her, you have to observe another 7 years. That would lead to a total of 14 years without any tumah involved in the story. 7 outside of Israel, 7 more years while in the land of Israel. Total of 14. No tumah as part of the story. There is the first possibility, though, is that the 14 years is as follows. She observed 7 years outside the land of Israel. When she came to Israel, she had to observe another 30 days in accordance to Beis Shammai. But she became Tamea, she became defiled during that time. And the defilement, the tumas meis that she experiences, thereby undoes all of her previous Nazirus. Not just the 30 days in Eretz Yisrael, but it undoes all 7 years beforehand. So she had to observe another 7 years. So you basically have 7 years outside the land of Israel, another maximum 30 days in Israel, during which time she became Tamea, forcing her to observe another 7 years. So you have a total of 14 years. However, with a tumah factor, as we just explained. So, two approaches have been presented. What really happened? Tashma. We have a long answer. Also, la'aretz v'hurua Beis Hillel shetei nazira oid sheva shanim achiros. And then in the Mishnah, it said, Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo hois nazira lo yudalid shana, 14 years. If Rabbi Yehuda's statement of not 21 but less, 14 years, was as a result of a Beis Shammai ruling involving 30 days more in Israel plus the Tumah, well then Ihachi, the language of the Mishnah doesn't reflect that approach. If that's so, the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo oisa nazir lo yudalid shana. Well, if it was in accordance with Beis Shammai, yudalid shana u'shloshim yomi boyalei, it should have said she observed a total of 14 years and 30 days, meaning 7 years outside the land of Israel, 30 more days, 1 month in Israel to fulfill the Beis Shammai requirement, and then becoming Tameh another 7 years, a total of 14 years and 30 days. But it doesn't say that. So it would seem then like the second possibility when we presented this, it was a case of lo nitmes in accordance with Beis Hillel. Tanya nami hachi. The Rashi comments toward the end of the narrow lines, the third to last narrow line, Tanya nami hachi, the Rabbi Yehuda Islay the chinitmes biyom melois moina shloishim. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that when a person becomes tamei at the end of the Nazirus period, they count 30 days. V'kevan desrile hachi, and since Rabbi Yehuda holds that when you become tamei at the end of a Nazirus period, you have to observe 30 days. In other words, even if you have, let's say, a long Nazirus, but you become tamei at the end of that long Nazirus, all you need to observe is another 30 days. Vadai hoda Rabbi Yehuda lo hois nazir lo yudalid shana. Therefore, that which Rabbi Yehuda said in our Mishnah regarding Hilni Amalka, that she observed 14 years, only 14 years, b'shelo nitmes, it must be that there was no tumah. The kapolei gatanakama disrile, and he argues with the Tanakama, disrile Rabbi Yehuda, the lo nitmes klal, she had not become Tameya at all. The Tanakama, if you recall, said that she observed 7 outside the land of Israel, 7 more in the land of Israel, and then she became Tameya. Rabbi Yehuda is here to tell us she never became Tameya. After 7 years outside of Israel, she entered Israel, and she received a ruling to observe another 7 years, total of 14. So now, we go back to the Gemara text, bearing in mind Rashi's explanation, what the role of this source is. It's not, otherwise without the Rashi, it's not so obvious. So Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a Tanaic source through which will then support the answer we gave before, that the Hilni story involved low nitmes and the 14 was as a result of holding like Beis Hillel. What does it say in this source? Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer. The Yomar Kra. Here you have Rabbi Yehuda quoting the Tana Rabbi Eliezer. The pasuk says, "Zois teras hanazir b'yom alois." Hater omra ki nitma b'yom alois tein lo toras nazir. The pasuk says that a nazir who becomes tamei at the concluding day of their nazirus. We've seen in the past situations where a person accepted 100 days of nazirus, and on day 100 they become tamei. What is necessary? What happens? They observe another 30 days. Toras Nazir means a basic 30 days of Nazirus. That having been said, if the Hilni Hamalka story involved Tumah, that she had 7 years outside of Israel and 30 days in accordance with Beis Shammai in Israel and then becoming Tameh, requiring her to observe another 7 years, it would have been a total of 14 years and 30 days. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.